Hey, this is Mr. Raymond here to introduce you to vectors. In this video, I'll just be covering what a vector is and how it's used in real life or mathematics. In later videos, I'll explaining how to perform operations with vectors and looking more into the actual math that goes along with them. So, what is a vector? Well, I always like to introduce people to vectors by telling them to watch the first Despicable Me movie, because the main villain in that story is actually named Vector. When he's first introduced, he exclaims that a vector is a mathematical term, a quantity represented by an arrow with both direction and magnitude. So let's break that down. Direction and magnitude. So direction is where that arrow is pointing. Remember, he said that it's represented by an arrow. So where it's pointing is going to be your direction. So for example, this vector right here, it's an arrow and it's pointing to the right. So the direction of it would be to the right. The magnitude is basically just a fancy word for length. So this vector here is 1, 2, 3 to the right. So its magnitude is 3 units and its direction is to the right. Now, in a future video, we'll talk about a better way to give directions of a vector, but for now, directions like up, down, or north or south, those will do just fine. Without both a magnitude and a direction, you can't have a vector. It's important real quick to note that a vector is not a ray. So a ray is another mathematical term, and it's used to describe something that goes on forever and ever in one direction. So while these two look the same, this ray will go on forever and ever in this direction. But this vector will start right here and stop right here. They do not continue on forever. So now that we know what a vector is, when are you ever going to use them? Well, it actually turns out that you've already been using vectors your whole life, and you don't even know it. When you give someone directions to another teacher's classroom, or you give them directions to your house, then you're giving those directions in the form of a vector. If you tell someone to go straight for 10 yards, that's a vector. You have a magnitude of 10 yards and a direction of straight. So 10 yards, straight. You've got your magnitude right here, and you've got your direction right here. If you're telling them to go home, or to get to your house, then you might say to follow Main Street east for 3 miles, and then go north on 2nd Street. In 2 miles, you'll be at my house. Well, you've actually put 2 vectors in there. You said to go east on Main Street for 3 miles. So you've got your first magnitude is 3 miles, and the direction is east. And then your second vector has a magnitude of 2 miles and a direction of north. So another time in your life that you're going to be using these is when you take physics. A lot of physics is going to be using vectors. Quantities like force or velocity or acceleration, displacement, momentum, all that stuff are vectors, and you're going to end up using those. Majority of those actually in the first semester of physics. So that's a quick overview of what vectors are. They must have a direction, they must have a magnitude. The direction is just telling you where that arrow is pointing, because remember, all vectors are represented by an arrow. And magnitude is just a fancy word for the length. One other last thing that we talked about was that a ray is different from a vector. You need to make sure that a vector has a definite start and stop, whereas a ray will continue on forever and ever in that one direction.